What's up, guys? This is Blank Boy, and today I'm going to be talking about Vultology and Embodied Cognition. Today it's just going to be an uncritical review of Vultology, just because there's so much to go over, and at a later date I'll be doing a critical review of Vultology. So first, let me go ahead and attribute credit to Auburn and Cognitive Type for discovering Vultology. I'm going to get into what is embodied cognition, what is Vultology, then some of the common misconceptions of Vultology, sort of the history of Vultology, and how it got to where it is today, some pilot studies trying to establish some validity of Vultology, and some studies going forward, studies happening that are not exactly trying to back Vultology, but that are related and in the psychology space. Alright, so first, what is embodied cognition? Embodied cognition is actually a rather old idea. It's just the idea that there is a bidirectional neurological feedback loop between cognitive processing and sensorimotor action. It's an old idea. It's interdisciplinary, drawing from systems biology, information theory, dynamical systems theory. Really, you can end up tracing it back to Martin Heidegger, and more recently Alan Turing. It's kind of interesting that that Turing should be involved in this, but I do think that embodied cognition can really help deal with some of the problems in machine learning. Don't worry if you're not in the machine learning space. I'm not going to get technical, but I'll just describe a problem. So if you want to teach a small child what a cat is, you can show them like one or two pictures of cats and say, this is a cat, and the child will generalize to other cats very well, or at least reasonably well. If we do the same thing to a computer, show a computer one or two images of cats and ask it to generalize very well, it does not. It sucks at it. If you show it 10,000 images of cats, then it can generalize pretty well, though it may still have problems if you rotate an image of a cat, or if you give it a much grainier photo than any photo it's seen, or if you give it a very dark photo in worse lighting conditions than anything it had seen. So even then, its generalization isn't great. But one of the reasons to believe that there is this difference, one of the explanations would be that the child is embodied learning from physical experience, from having a body and having this feedback loop between a real physical body and reality and this child's mind, in a way that a computer does not. Right, computers don't have bodies. Yes, they have like literal physical parts, but right, those are not sense organs or anything like that. So we see embodied cognition in the work of George Lakoff and Francisco Varela, people like that. Lakoff did some real interesting work in linguistics, especially demonstrating that things like reason and grammar are not just purely abstract things that we come to the way a computer might, but that they are based on bodily experience. One example of how you can see this is a really interesting paper from Williams and Barg. I hope I'm pronouncing that second name right, but this is from 2008. They showed how experiencing physical warmth promotes the perception of interpersonal warmth. They had people each holding a warm cup of coffee or a cold cup of coffee, and interacting with a stranger. The strangers are paid actors who are in on the experiment, so they're acting just as warm or cold to everyone, but those holding the warm cup of coffee ended up rating them on average more interpersonally warm than those holding the cold cup of coffee. And this is a really interesting experiment, because if we just think about it, right, interpersonal warmth is entirely a metaphor, right? They're people who seem warm, they're not literally emitting more heat than other people. So even though it's just a metaphor, you can prime someone physically to interpret the metaphor associated with that physical thing, more highly. Really interesting. Really strange that should work at all. Another example of this is something called EMDR, or eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. This is a therapy devised by Francine Shapiro. That this works at all is very strange. If this were not published in Nature in 2019, Nature, a very prestigious journal, I would probably not believe it. But it is, and the therapy is this. So it is a form of therapy. It's where you have someone recount a traumatic experience, something that they still have some emotional weight attached to. You have them recount this experience while they're going like this, while they're moving their eyes laterally. And this ends up decoupling the emotional experience from the memory. Very strange, very bizarre that this works at all, but it does. It is approved for clinical use. It is being used today in clinical settings, and the proposed mechanism for why this works is that there is a suppression of the amygdala, that the threat detection center of the amygdala is being quieted, and so somehow from there the emotional component of this memory is being separated from the memory itself. Really strange that something as simple as the way you move your eyes when recounting a memory should have such a dramatic effect. So these are just a couple examples of embodied cognition at work. So what is Vultology? Vultology is the idea that because cognition is embodied, and so the expressions that you'll see from a person are not random, but predictable based on what you've seen them do before. Not only that, but there's some, that someone's expression may be clustered with other similar individuals, that these expression clusters are heritable. There's a hereditary component, and these clusters demonstrate psychological similarities within a given cluster. Let's talk about some common misconceptions of Vultology. I just want to talk about 4 of these real quick. The first one is that it's culturally relative. I've heard things like, well, in my culture, we don't look at the speaker while they're talking to you. That's impolite. Excuse me. Or, well, in my culture, we nod our heads in this way, and most cultures you don't, and not only do we do that, but we nod our heads much more often, much more frequently than in other cultures. or things like, well, in my culture, all of the men have big bushy beards, and so you can't even really see the bottom half of their face very well. So to the first point, I want to point out that Vultology is not, it's not something that specific as looking at the audience in their eyes, or something like that. It's not about what in particular you are looking at, or something like that. That's not a signal. To the second point about nodding one's head, absolutely, some cultures have different symbolic gestures than others, right? Something like a thumbs up. And I want to point out that no one single gesture, especially not a symbolic gesture, is considered a Vultological signal. That's not, again, not considered a Vultological signal. In such a culture where nodding one's head like this is a symbolic gesture, I want to point out that not everyone is nodding their head with the exact same frequency, right? Some people are nodding their head much more frequently than others. Some, not very much at all. So if it were just like uniform, absolutely everyone is nodding their head the exact same amount, okay, that would be a problem, but that's not what you see. Unfortunately, if you just look for online resources on Vultology today, you won't see a great demonstration of this or example of this, but yeah, you can definitely investigate it yourself. Then to the point about big bushy beards, to be sure, that would obscure some signals. Not all signals. You certainly can read the Vultology of a person with a big bushy beard. There are, though, some things you won't be able to see. Absolutely. I don't think that disproves the whole thing just because I might be covering up my mouth. So the second misconception that I hear a lot is that people who have facial abnormalities, or maybe someone who's like paralyzed or something, that they would not be able to be typed with it, disproving the rule. And I want to point out that that's correct. Absolutely, someone who is paralyzed would not be able to be typed Vultologically. Someone who had their face horribly burned with acid, the musculature of their face probably is going to be very different from most people's, and also would not be able to be typed Vultologically. I don't think those exceptions disprove the rule. I think if anything, they at the same time, they don't prove the rule. They just, there are exceptions. I mean, what do you want? Yeah, obviously you can't type a paralyzed person based on their movement. Another one I've heard is about trained speakers, that if someone's a trained speaker, you won't be able to get an accurate reading because they're so well trained. A trained public speaker. This too, not this too, but just I think this speaks to signals that are and are not under conscious control. So yes, there are signals that are under conscious control, and those who have been trained as a public speaker will show different Vultology, based on their training. That being said, there's also many signals that are not under conscious control, or that cannot be emulated by someone of a different cluster. And okay, that's going to be the more reliable signals, the signals that you're trying to use more. But yeah, absolutely, someone with trained speaking can mess with a reading, absolutely. Again, I don't think this disproves the whole of it, just because there are some things under conscious control. Then another thing that I hear is people saying, sure, there are these expression clusters, I guess, but they don't actually have anything to do with type. Sure, that's one thing, but type is over here, it's this other thing. And I want to point out two things. So one, Vultology was not devised once and then it just sat there and, okay, cool, it's perfect, it's crystalline, it's let's not touch it. It was developed with a tight feedback loop between observation and theory, such that it underwent changes and revisions as the psychology of the people giving off whatever signals informed the theory. And the thought of what does and does not constitute a signal. This is actually an advantage, I think, that Vultology has over many such typing systems, that the feedback loop between observation and theory is, respected, and there's not as much of a chance. There certainly is some chance, but there's not as much of a chance of sort of runaway theory, just sort of driving the whole thing without any regard for receiving feedback from the real world. One final misconception that you hear a lot is people saying something like, I was nervous when I was being typed, or I have ADHD and I think that was throwing things off. Some sort of neurological atypicalness. And so they say, well, so my Vultology is not accurate to my actual cognition. And to that I would say it is accurate, right? Yes, absolutely. You being nervous is going to come across in some way. You being energized is going to come across differently than if you're really tired. You being happy is going to come across differently than if you're really sad. Even though we're not trying to look for specific emotional signals, right? Emotional expression is one thing, Vultology is another. But a happy and sad person will, the same person who's happy and sad will express differently. So obviously you would want a representative sample of yourself if you were trying to be accurately typed in Vultology. I don't think that makes it invalid. I think that means, okay, yes, it is actually reading what's going on, inside of you. What is your psychological state at, right? I think probably the most obvious example of this is someone who's really tired and just like, and not really giving off that much, versus someone who just drank a big cup of coffee and they're wired. So obviously they will express differently in those different circumstances, but I don't think that's any reason to believe that Vultology is not correctly picking up on something. All right, let's talk about the history of Vultology. How did it come to be? So my understanding is that in the late 2000s, the late noughts, around 2009, 2010, there was a group called Podlayer that frequented certain online typology forums like intpforum.com, and they purported that you could use people's expressions, not any static features of them, but their movements, their dynamic expression. You could use this to type people. And in fact, they were so confident in what they had found, and it was actually rather well received online, which is funny because Socionics visual identification is not very well received, but Socionics visual identification, to my knowledge, and I cannot read Russian, so I am restricted to just the English translations. The visual reading in Socionics is, as far as I know, just based on static signals, static facial features. So PodLayer was not doing that. They were looking at expressions and movement, and they were so confident that they put out a challenge saying, hey, if anyone can type people more reliably and consistently and predictably than we can, then I don't actually know. I don't know what they were going to give these people, anyone who won the challenge or whatever. But Auburn and a small group accepted the challenge, and they started what they called at the time the Modus Project, where they tried to look at many interviews of famous people on YouTube, and catalog which ones are really trying to catalog every single last expression that they saw very meticulously. Because what they were doing was so meticulous, they were really trying to do this a-theoretically, just starting from scratch. It very quickly just ballooned out of control and became way too much work than was feasible. So unfortunately, they abandoned the original a-theoretical vision, and they ended up, to my knowledge, sort of starting with PodLayer's original signals as a baseline, and then reworking and revising those signals to be more easily summarizable, more quantifiable, more easily teachable to someone who was totally unfamiliar. I'm not sure what exactly came of PodLayer. PodLayer has all but completely disappeared. There is still a website that's up though, but this original answering this PodLayer challenge was not where the development of Vultology stopped. As mentioned previously, he was using this tight feedback loop between observation and theory to refine the canonical cognitive type Vultological signals, and his ideas of what it meant to have a certain function or to be a certain type, this sort of thing. Alright, let's talk pilot studies. There's really just two of these to mention, so these were both done by Auburn. The first one is a look at identical twins and identical twins separated at birth. So there were 40 individuals, 20 pairs of twins, and many of them had been separated at birth, some of them had not. Auburn had typed all 40 of these individuals and discovered that all of the pairs of twins showed the same type and the same subtype based on whatever the subtype system that was being used in that iteration. So this is really cool. This is demonstrating that, okay, there is something hereditary going on here. I believe the current thinking is that function axes are hereditary, but not necessarily energetics, so things like EJ, IJ, EP, IP, those sorts of things. But let's say two parents, one who is a Socionics gamma, right, with SENI and TEFI, and the other parent who is, let's say, a socionics beta, SENI but FETI, that these two people would be able to have children who have either judgment axis but only the SENI perception axis. Of course, when we're talking about genetics, right, we're talking about more than just parents. We also want to talk about grandparents and great-grandparents and all this sort of thing, and recessive genes. While that is the current line of thought, I don't know how rigorously that's been studied, and what kinds of things you would see, what kind of exceptions to that rule you would see, that you would need to look at grandparents to explain. But all right, that is just that identical twin study. The other study I want to mention is the career trends study. So Auburn also did a study on a sample of individuals that is honestly skewed toward the hyper successful. So it was a bunch of famous people basically, and he was looking at what careers cluster around which types, and there were some statistically significant trends identified, though there is a grain of salt to take that with, because the sample population was very not random. But all right, that was another such pilot study looking into the validity of Vultological types. Finally, there is active research in the field of psychology going on in parallel to Vultology that is really interesting, and also giving credence to Vultology, whether they're aware of it or not. There is experiments going on in the area of visual search and personality traits, of language comprehension. This is more like priming based on embodied cognition, like the coffee cup example before, and the link between moral and oral disgust. So the first one with visual search, we've got experiments going on where people are taking a look at eye movement data, tracking people's eye movement very meticulously, and trying to find a link between their visual search and some personality traits, especially things like openness. So this is just one very interesting parallel going on right now. We've also got some experiments going on with language comprehension. The ones that I'm aware of are more like the coffee cup example mentioned earlier, where let's just use that coffee cup example. We're priming someone to experience warmth, to have the physical experience of warmth, and then in having them parse some more complex sentences about something like interpersonal warmth, they're more able to do it with something like interpersonal warmth as they are experiencing this warm coffee cup, as opposed to some sentences that are not related, that have nothing to do with temperature or the metaphor of temperature. Really cool stuff. Then there's also some experiments looking at the link between moral and oral disgust. So here I am talking about not just disgust expressed by the mouth, though that is how I said it, I guess, because I said oral, but also just disgust on the face, how this facial expression from an evolutionary perspective ties into moral disgust, right? So we're not talking about disease or cleanliness or anything like that, but we are talking about moral judgments, and they're looking at the link between those two things. Also, just a really cool, interesting parallel set of studies going on. When I say parallel, I mean parallel to Vultology and the sorts of things that people interested in Vultology are looking at. Alright, cool. Thanks for watching.